The interstellar medical concordate had been operational for approximately 4,000 standard cycles, and in that time, it had successfully treated every conceivable injury across 732 member species. Their facilities gleamed with sterile perfection, their instruments hummed with precision, and their surgeons possessed tentacles, appendages, and manipulators trained to reconstruct everything from crystalline lung matrices to photosynthetic dermis layers. They had saved lives that operated on principles, ranging from carbon-based chemistry to exotic matter states that shouldn't technically exist outside of laboratory conditions. Not once, in 4 millennia, had their emergency trauma wing ever declared a case theoretically impossible. Until today. The problem, as with most problems that plagued the orderly functioning of galactic civilization, involved humans. Those magnificent disasters, from Sol 3, that revolving ball of meteorological violence and biological hostility that somehow produced a sentient species, instead of simply exterminating all life like a sensible Deathworld should. The galaxy had spent the better part of 2 centuries trying to integrate humans into civilized space, which was rather like trying to integrate a plasma grenade into a children's toy box, technically possible, but inadvisable for everyone's continued existence. The Calathrun Medical Institute, flagship hospital of the Concordat and pride of the Antari sector, occupied a space station that could have housed a small moon. Its corridors stretched in mathematically perfect curves. Its atmosphere was calibrated to .001 precision for optimal multi-species comfort, and its safety record was so impeccable that insurance companies occasionally sent inspectors just to weep tears of joy at the documentation. This was where they brought Cadet Marcus Chen after the incident. The incident being a term that medical professionals used when they didn't want to say catastrophic trauma that should have resulted in immediate death in front of the patient's commanding officers. Dr. Valaxis, senior reconstructive surgeon, and a Threno D whose species had evolved on a paradise world, where the most dangerous predator was a particularly aggressive flowering plant, stood in the observation theater, staring at the diagnostic screens with 3 of his 4 eyes. The 4th eye had closed in what his species did instead of fainting a voluntary shutdown of sensory input when confronted with something too horrible to process. "This cannot be correct," he said, his translator rendering his melodious whistle speech into flat galactic standard. "Run the scanner again. There must be interference." His assistant, a young Piltovian named Rexic, whose gelatinous form rippled with nervousness, manipulated the controls with pseudopods that trembled visibly. "Sir, I have run it 4 times. The readings are consistent." "Consistent," Valaxis repeated, his vocal harmonics suggesting he was considering either retirement or perhaps just walking into the nearest airlock. "Consistently impossible." On the surgical table beyond the observation glass lay Cadet Marcus Chen, 22 standard years old, recently enrolled in the Galactic Defense Initiative's training program, and the proud owner of what used to be a face. The training accident had been nobody's fault, really, just an unfortunate collision during a zero-gravity combat simulation, when another cadet's momentum had carried them into Chen with the combined kinetic force of roughly 2,000 newtons. For most species in civilized space, such an impact would have resulted in mild bruising, perhaps a temporary disruption of their protective mucus layers, or a cracked exoskeleton plate that would regenerate within days. These were species that had evolved on sensible worlds with reasonable gravity, appropriate atmospheric pressure, and predators that had the common decency to be slow and easily avoided. Humans had evolved on Earth. Earth, that astronomical middle finger to the concept of habitability, where the atmosphere was a corrosive oxygen mixture that literally rusted metal, where the gravity was so excessive that it compressed their skeletal structure into absurd density, where the weather patterns included rotating columns of destructive wind that the humans had nicknamed and tracked like sporting events, and where the native fauna included everything from microscopic parasites that ate flesh to megafauna that ate humans, who then had the audacity to eat the megafauna right back. And humans, those wonderful idiots, had emerged from this hellscape, looked around at the galaxy, and decided they wanted to join the military. The diagnostic readout showed what happened when Deathworld physiology met standard training equipment designed for civilized species. Marcus Chen's facial structure. And here Valaxis had to pause to understand the sheer biological absurdity contained actual bone. Not flexible cartilage, not regenerative chitin, not adaptive crystalline matrix, but calcium-based skeletal material that when subjected to sufficient force, fractured, shattered, broke into pieces like primitive pottery. His nasal structure, a bizarre protrusion of cartilage and bone that served as an air intake valve, had been compressed inward. The orbital sockets protecting his optical organs had cracked. The mandible, a solid piece of bone that somehow moved to facilitate food intake, had become dislocated from its attachment points at the temporal region. Several of his teeth, those exposed mineral deposits that humans used for mechanically processing food, because apparently evolution on Earth hadn't discovered the efficiency of chemical breakdown, had been knocked loose or fractured. And he was still alive. How? Valaxis asked the universe in general. Is he still alive? Rexic's form rippled, in what might have been a shrug if gelatinous species could shrug. Human resilience, sir. Their medical files indicate they can survive tissue damage that would kill most species 3 times over. I have read their medical files, Valaxis said, his translator probably not adequately conveying his existential distress. I thought they were exaggerated. Perhaps errors in translation. A species cannot actually function with their vital processing organ protected by only a thin cage of bone and no redundant backups. And yet, Valaxis agreed miserably. The surgery briefing occurred in Conference Room 7, which had been designed to comfortably accommodate up to 15 different species with varying environmental needs. Currently, it held 8 of the Institute's finest surgeons, all of whom looked like they'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. Dr. Shannara, a Vexillian whose species had mastered regenerative medicine to the point where they could regrow entire limbs in under a week, tapped her datapad with one of her 6 fingers. I have reviewed the human medical literature on facial reconstruction. It is, she paused, searching for words that wouldn't violate professional decorum, disturbingly primitive. They cut into their own flesh. Another surgeon added, a Korathi named Plex, whose crystalline structure refracted the conference room lighting into anxious rainbows. With blades, and then they use threaded fiber to pull the flesh back together and hope it heals. That is what stitches are, yes, Valaxis confirmed, feeling about 2,000 years old. But that is what we do for fabric, Plex protested. For repairing equipment, not for medical procedures on living beings. Valaxis pulled up a holographic display of the surgical plan he'd been developing for the past 3 hours. It looked to his trained eye like something a first-year medical student would draft as a joke. According to human medical protocols, we need to realign the fractured bone segments, secure them with IM. Reading this correctly, metal pins and plates, reconstruct the nasal cartilage structure, reposition the mandible, and address the damaged teeth. Do they not simply regenerate? Someone asked hopefully. No. Do they have backup teeth that will grow in? Not at his age. Could we clone replacement tissue? Human cloning is illegal in their culture, and their cellular rejection response to non-identical genetic material is so aggressive that it might actually kill him faster than the injury. The conference room fell silent except for the gentle hum of life support systems and someone's translator making distressed clicking noises. So we must, Shannara said slowly, physically reconstruct his facial architecture using primitive mechanical fasteners, trust that his body will not reject these foreign objects, and hope that his cellular regeneration, which operates without any apparent medical supervision at the molecular level, simply decides to heal correctly. That is an accurate summary, yes. This is insane. He is human. Insanity is apparently a survival trait on their world. Dr. Valaxis had performed over 3,000 reconstructive surgeries in his career. He had rebuilt patients who had been caught in industrial accidents, who had survived ship decompression, who had been on the wrong end of mining equipment or chemical explosions. He had never, not once, felt unprepared for a procedure. He felt unprepared now. The surgical theater had been reconfigured for human-compatible atmosphere, that vicious oxygen mixture that humans breathed like it wasn't slowly oxidizing their own cellular structure, and the temperature had been adjusted to what humans considered comfortable, which was approximately the temperature of a Threnody fever state. Marcus Chen lay on the surgical platform, mercifully unconscious through the liberal application of anesthetics. Even here, humans were difficult. Most species responded predictably to standard sedatives. Humans required careful calibration because their metabolism was so aggressive that they processed drugs at alarming rates, and their nervous system was so primitive yet robust that finding the balance between unconscious and cardiac arrest was apparently an art form. The surgical team had assembled, Valaxis as lead surgeon, Shannara on reconstructive support, 2 Korathi assistants whose crystalline precision was invaluable for delicate work, and a human medical consultant named Dr. James Okonkwo, who had been hastily called in from the human medical vessel 3 stations over, and who looked at the assembled alien surgeons with an expression that suggested he was having the worst day of his career. "Right," Okonkwo said, reviewing the scans on his datapad. "So this is bad, but it is not worst-case scenario." "Not worst case," Valaxis repeated. "His facial structure is compromised in 17 places." "Yeah, but his brain is intact, no spinal damage, and oh good his airway is clear. We can work with this." Okonkwo had the unsettling human trait of sounding optimistic about situations that should inspire existential dread. "I will walk you through standard facial trauma reconstruction protocols. The good news is that human faces are actually pretty resilient once you get everything back in the right place." "How is that possible when they are made of material that breaks?" "Well, that is the neat part," Okonkwo said with what could only be described as inappropriate enthusiasm. "Bone heals stronger than before if you set it correctly. Humans break bones all the time. It is practically a hobby for some of us." The Korathi assistant made a sound like cracking ice, which was probably swearing. "Let us begin," Valaxis said, activating his surgical implements with a sense of impending doom. The first challenge was accessing the damaged nasal structure. In most species, this would involve carefully parting flexible tissue, applying regenerative gel, and allowing the body's natural processes to take over. In humans, it required, and Valaxis had to steady himself cutting through tissue to expose the underlying bone structure. "Make the incision along the nasal bridge," Okonkwo instructed. "Yes, like that. Do not worry about the bleeding. Humans bleed enthusiastically, but have excellent clotting factors." "Enthusiastically," Valaxis muttered. Watching red fluid, actual iron-based hemoglobin, how barbaric seep into the surgical field. Automated systems immediately began suction and cleaning, but the sheer volume was alarming. "That is normal." "Oh yes. Head wounds bleed like crazy, lots of blood vessels in the face. Great for healing, terrible for neat surgery." Valaxis carefully exposed the fractured nasal bones. They were, as the scans had shown, broken in 3 places. In his entire medical career, he had never had to manually realign skeletal fragments. His own species simply absorbed damaged tissue and regrew it. This was like being asked to repair a shattered ceramic sculpture while it was still alive and might die if he made a mistake. "You will need to align the segments and then stabilize them," Okonkwo said. "We would typically use a splint, but given the other facial damage, internal pins are better. The bone will calcify around them." "The bone will what?" "Grow around the pins. Incorporate them." Human bones are living tissue that constantly remodel themselves. Those pins will be permanent fixtures, and his body will just accept them. Shannara's translator made a sound that suggested profound biological confusion. "That should cause rejection. Foreign material in living tissue triggers immune response." "Not if it is the right material," Okonkwo said cheerfully. "Titanium works great. Biocompatible. We have been doing this for centuries." Centuries. Humans had been deliberately inserting metal into their bodies for centuries. As medicine. And they called this progress. Valaxis selected the smallest titanium pins from the surgical kit equipment that had been rush delivered from human medical supplies and looked disturbingly like construction materials, and began the delicate process of drilling microscopic holes into living bone. This was someone's face, someone's actual face, and he was drilling into it. The procedure continued with a sort of horrified momentum. The nasal reconstruction led to addressing the orbital fractures, which were thankfully minor but still required, ensuring the bone fragments around Marcus Chen's eyes were properly positioned, so that the optical organs, those absurdly vulnerable jelly-filled spheres that humans used for vision, would not be compromised. The orbital socket will heal on its own, Okonkwo assured them. Just make sure the alignment is correct. Human skulls are pretty good at bone regeneration. How do they protect their processing organ if their skulls are so easily damaged? Well, that is the thing, they do not really. Humans just have to avoid head trauma. It is a whole thing in our culture. Do not get hit in the head is basically rule 1. That seems like a significant design flaw. Evolution is not about perfect design. It is about good enough to reproduce. And humans reproduce just fine, so Okonkwo shrugged, a gesture that Valaxis had learned meant humans accepted their own biological absurdity as inevitable. The mandible reattachment was perhaps the most disturbing part of the procedure. The human jaw, Valaxis discovered, was held in place by a complex arrangement of muscles, ligaments, and a joint that allowed the entire bone to move. When dislocated, it simply stopped working. The entire feeding mechanism of the human face depended on this one articulated connection. You will need to manipulate the condyle back into the temporal fossa, Okonkwo explained, using terms that sounded medical but described an action that seemed more appropriate for mechanical repair. It might take some force. Force, Valaxis repeated weakly. Just pop it back in. You will feel it seat properly. Under Okonkwo's guidance, Valaxis grasped the mandible and applied pressure. There was resistance, then a distinctly audible click as the joint relocated. Every surgeon in the theater flinched. Perfect, Okonkwo said. See, easy. Nothing about this was easy. Nothing about this was sane. And yet Marcus Chen's biological readings remained stable, his body simply accepting this mechanical reconstruction like it was the most natural thing in the world. The dental work was mercifully straightforward by comparison. 2 teeth had been completely avulsed and would need replacement. Later humans had entire medical specialties devoted to tooth replacement because, of course, they did, while 3 others had fractures that required bonding and sealing. Those teeth will probably need crowns eventually, Okonkwo noted, but for now, just stabilize them. Human teeth are incredibly strong for what they are. Enamel is the hardest biological substance in the human body. Harder than bone? Yep. And it does not regenerate at all. What you are born with is what you get. Well, humans get 2 sets, baby teeth and adult teeth, but after that, you are done. The implications of that were staggering. Humans had evolved a feeding mechanism that wore out and simply could not be replaced naturally. What kind of evolutionary pressure produced that? Earth. Earth produced that. Earth, where apparently being able to bite through tough materials was more valuable than having teeth that would last a lifetime. 4 hours into the surgery, Valaxis realized something strange. It was working. The fractured segments had been aligned and stabilized. The soft tissue had been reconstructed. The swelling was being managed by medications that Okonkwo had provided with the casual confidence of someone who had seen this 100 times before. Marcus Chen's face, while still bearing the marks of trauma and recent surgery, was beginning to resemble a face again rather than a catastrophic anatomical failure. His body is already starting the healing process, Shenora observed, monitoring cellular activity. The inflammatory response is significant but controlled. White blood cell counts are elevated but stable. His metabolism is, she paused, rechecking her instruments. Why is his metabolism operating at this rate? This is fever levels. That is normal for humans, Okonkwo said. We run hot, helps with healing. Humans heal fast compared to most mammals or most Earth species. Cuts that would take weeks and other species heal in days for us. Broken bones knit in weeks rather than months. That should require enormous caloric intake. It does. Humans eat constantly. Well, by civilized space standards, 3 to 5 times a day. The surgical team exchanged glances that suggested they were reconsidering everything they thought they knew about biology. The final stages of the procedure involved closing the incisions, with those ridiculous stitches literally sewing flesh together with thread like it was fabric, and applying dermal sealant to accelerate surface healing. Okonkwo supervised this with the ease of someone who had done this so many times it was routine. "He will be in pain when he wakes up," Okonkwo said matter-of-factly. "Significant pain. Human pain tolerance is pretty high, but facial injuries hurt like hell. We will keep him on analgesics, and he will probably need liquid nutrition for a few days, until the swelling goes down. Will there be scarring? Some. Humans scar easily. But with proper care, it will fade. He is young, his collagen production is still excellent. In a few months, you will barely be able to tell this happened. In a few months. Other species would require years of regenerative treatment for comparable injuries. Some might never fully recover. Humans would just heal, because their bodies had apparently decided that being able to recover from horrific trauma was more important than avoiding the trauma in the first place. Deathworld logic. Earth logic. Absolutely insane. Post-operative observation was standard procedure for any major surgery, but monitoring a human presented unique challenges. Their baseline vitals looked like medical distress in most species, heart rate that would indicate panic, blood pressure that suggested imminent cardiovascular failure, metabolic activity that seemed appropriate for someone running for their life. All normal, Okonkwo assured the night staff. Just check on him every hour. If his breathing becomes labored or his pupils do not respond to light, page me immediately. Otherwise, let him sleep. Humans heal best when unconscious. Marcus Chen woke 16 hours after surgery, which was apparently typical for human recovery from anesthesia. His first words, translated through the standard interface since his mouth was swollen and movement painful, were, "Did I miss the rest of training?" Valaxis, who had stayed through the night out of professional anxiety and perhaps morbid curiosity, stared at the young human. "You have sustained significant facial trauma. Training is not the priority." "But did I miss it?" "You will be in recovery for weeks." The human made a sound that the translator rendered as frustrated but accepting. "Okay. Can I get something to eat? I am starving." Of course, he was. Humans were always starving. Their ridiculous metabolism demanded constant feeding, like they were trying to power a small fusion reactor with biological processes alone. "Liquid nutrition only for now," Valaxis said. "Your jaw needs time to stabilize." "Cool. So soup?" "Medical nutrient suspension." So terrible soup. Despite everything, Valaxis found himself making the Threnody equivalent of a laugh. This human had been struck with enough force to shatter his face, had undergone hours of reconstructive surgery involving actual metal pins being drilled into his skull, and his primary concern was the quality of his soup. Over the following days, the medical staff observed the human healing process with the fascination of scientists discovering a new form of physics that violated everything they thought they knew but somehow worked anyway. The swelling reduced at rates that seemed aggressive. The bruising spectacular displays of purple and green, as blood vessels repaired themselves under the skin changed color daily. The incisions began to seal within 72 hours. The bone structures, monitored via continuous scanning, showed active calcification as cells literally rebuilt the fractured areas. "He should be in significantly more pain," Shannara observed on day 3. "The nerve damage alone should be debilitating." Humans produce their own pain management chemicals, Okonkwo explained, having stayed on station to supervise. Endorphins. Natural opioids. Their brains just release them when needed. Very handy for a species that injures themselves constantly. Marcus Chen, for his part, was the worst patient the medical staff had ever treated, primarily because he was bored. Humans, it turned out, did not do well with enforced rest. By day 4, he was attempting to do exercises in his room. By day 6, he was trying to convince the staff to let him access the station's training facilities. "Absolutely not," Valaxis said firmly. "You are still healing. I feel fine." Your facial structure was catastrophically compromised less than a week ago. Yeah, but I am better now. See? The human carefully demonstrated his jaw's range of motion, which was admittedly impressive but still not even close to fully healed. You have metal pins in your face. Cool, right? Like a cyborg. No, not cool. Medically necessary and vaguely horrifying. But the human seemed genuinely pleased about his internal hardware. By day 10, Valaxis had to admit that Marcus Chen was recovering at a rate that would be impressive for minor injuries, let alone facial reconstruction. The scans showed solid bone regeneration. The soft tissue had regained most of its structural integrity. The risk of infection, always a concern with humans, and their exposed wounds had been successfully managed. On day 14, Dr. Okonkwo cleared him to return to light duty. Light duty, Valaxis emphasized. No combat training. No high-impact activities. No getting hit in the face. Yeah, I know. The human's translator conveyed amusement. I will be careful. Valaxis doubted that. Humans were never careful. They were lucky, resilient, and apparently too stubborn to die even when they should, but careful was not in their behavioral repertoire. The final examination occurred 3 weeks after the initial surgery. Marcus Chen sat in the examination chair while Valaxis performed detailed scans and assessments. The results were, in a word, impossible. The bone structures had healed completely, not just stabilized, not just partially regenerated, completely healed. The fractures were visible only as slightly denser areas, where the bone had calcified around the pins. The soft tissue showed minimal scarring. The teeth that had been stabilized were firmly rooted again. The range of motion in his jaw was 98% of normal function. How do you feel? Valaxis asked, because at this point, empirical data was more reliable than his instruments. Pretty good. Face is still a little tender, but nothing serious. I can eat solid food again, which is great because the soup was getting old. The human paused. Thanks, by the way, for fixing my face. The other surgeon said you were really worried about it. You had 17 fracture sites. Worry was appropriate. Sure, but you fixed it. So thanks. Such casual gratitude for a procedure that had required 4 hours of precision surgery and the complete reconstruction of his facial anatomy. As though it was just another medical appointment, another routine intervention. Nothing particularly special. For humans, perhaps it was. Perhaps being injured and requiring extensive medical intervention was just another Tuesday for a species from Earth. You are welcome, Valaxis said, because what else could he say? Try not to get hit in the face again. I will do my best. Marcus Chen said with what was almost certainly a smile under the residual swelling. No promises though. Training is pretty intense. Of course it was. The report that Valaxis filed with the Interstellar Medical Concordat after Marcus Chen's discharge was possibly the strangest document he had ever written. It detailed successful surgical intervention on a species whose biology seemed designed to be just barely functional enough to survive, but not so functional as to actually prevent injuries. It noted healing rates that exceeded all projected models. It included detailed protocols for future facial reconstruction on humans, should such procedures be necessary again and given humanity's apparent relationship with injury. They would be necessary. The report concluded with a recommendation that human medical specialists be integrated into all major Concordat facilities, not because the alien surgeons could not learn to treat humans, but because understanding human medicine required accepting biological premises that violated most civilized species' understanding of how life should work. Humans broke easily but healed fast. They injured themselves constantly, but had developed sophisticated medical interventions to address those injuries. They were fragile and resilient in equal measure, vulnerable and nearly indestructible depending on the metric, and they approached their own physical damage with a casual acceptance that suggested either profound wisdom or complete insanity. Probably both. The galaxy had spent centuries trying to integrate humans into civilized society, updating regulations, modifying equipment, adjusting protocols. But perhaps the real adjustment was not making space safe for humans, but rather accepting that humans would never be truly safe. They came from a world that had tried to kill them for millions of years, and they had simply learned to survive anyway. 3 months later, Valaxis received a message from the Galactic Defense Initiative's Training Academy. It included a photograph of recent graduates, including one Cadet Marcus Chen, who had completed his combat certification with honors. The human's face showed minimal scarring, just a slight line along the nasal bridge and a barely visible mark on the jaw. He was smiling that peculiar human expression that involved baring their teeth in what should have been threat display, but somehow communicated pleasure, and giving a gesture with his hand that the attached note explained was a thumbs up, indicating success or approval. Valaxis saved the image to his personal files, a reminder of perhaps his most challenging case, and also the most successful. He had reconstructed a human face using techniques that would have seemed barbaric a century ago, and the patient had not only survived but thrived. Deathworlders. They came to the galaxy with their fragile bodies and their metal pins and their ridiculous metabolism. And somehow they made it work. The universe, Valaxis reflected, had been a much more sensible place before humans arrived. Less interesting, certainly. Significantly safer and more predictable. But much, much more boring. He closed the file and returned to his scheduled surgeries, a routine cartilage regeneration on a Vexillion, standard stuff, nothing that would require drilling into anyone's skull or sewing their flesh together like fabric. Nice, normal, civilized medicine. Somewhere in the station, the emergency alert system pinged. Another training accident. Another human cadet. Something about a dislocated shoulder during zero-gravity maneuvers. Valaxis sighed, updated his schedule, and pulled up the human medical protocols again. Just another day in the Concordat. Just another human being magnificently, impossibly, absurdly resilient. Just another reminder that the galaxy would never be quite the same.